In the deep heart of Georgia, 1842, when cotton was still called white gold, a single woman ruled her land with the silence of thunder. Her name was Ella Lanena Whitfield, widow, matriarch, and self-appointed guardian of the Whitfield bloodline. To outsiders, she was elegance incarnate, a figure framed by lace curtains and ivory pillars, always in white, always still. But inside the great house that bore her name, people whispered a different truth, that her beauty was colder than marble, and her heart had hardened into stone the day her husband died. The Whitfield plantation stretched farther than the eye could see, over 2,000 acres of soil, red as rust, dotted with cabins, smokehouses, and the endless rows of cotton that shimmered beneath the southern Sunday. 200 enslaved people worked that land, and when Thomas Whitfield's sudden fever carried him to the grave, all of it, land, wealth, and lives, passed into her hands. That was rare for a woman in those days, rarer still, in a world where law and faith both preached submission. But Ella Lanena believed the law of men was no match for the will of God, and she believed God had chosen her. In the town of Millhaven, whispers followed her carriage wherever it went. "A woman shouldn't run an estate that size alone," the preacher's wife murmured. "She's proud," said another, "too proud for her own salvation." Yet no one dared challenge her. Her family name had power, and her late husband's influence lingered like perfume, fading but still potent. Each Sunday, she sat in the front pew of the small white church, unmoving, her gloved hands folded tight around her black fan. She rarely blinked during the sermons, even when the preacher spoke of humility and sin. People said she listened not for redemption but for confirmation, proof that the strong were meant to rule and the weak to serve. At home, she governed the plantation like a general. Her 5 daughters, Marianne, Louise, Clara, and the twins, Eleanor and Ruth, were raised more like heirs than girls. They were taught grace, obedience, and silence. And yet, whenever Ella Lanena looked at them, a flicker of disappointment crossed her face. "They have my beauty," she once told the mirror, "but not his strength." That strength, she believed, was divine, and it had died with her husband. In his absence, she vowed to preserve it by any means. The Whitfields, she told herself, were destined for greatness, their blood pure and superior. But purity, like all obsessions, demands sacrifice. Each evening, after supper, the mistress retired to her late husband's study. The room smelled of cedar, old ledgers, and grief. On the mantel hung Thomas Whitfield's portrait, a stern man with blue eyes that seemed to watch her even in the dark. She would pour herself a glass of port, light a single candle, and speak softly to the painting. "You left me too soon," she whispered, "but I will finish what you began." Her hands trembled as she opened one of the plantation ledgers, pages lined with names, birth dates, and appraisals. She read them the way others read scripture. To her, these were not lives, but numbers, weights, instruments of legacy. The world around her believed the order of things was ordained white over black, men over women, masters over the earth itself. Ella Lanena simply took that belief and bent it until it suited her purpose. The servants called her times the White Queen Asterisk. The overseer, a man named Burke, called her times Madam Asterisk. But in truth, even he feared her. "Ain't no telling what that woman thinks at night," he once muttered after too much whiskey. "She looks at a field and sees the future. She looks at a man and sees what she can take from him." The house itself seemed to reflect its mistress, immaculate but lifeless. Every chair aligned, every drape pressed, every sound absorbed by heavy walls. Even laughter died quickly in its halls. The daughters learned early that joy had a cost. Affection was weakness. When a music teacher from Savannah once complimented young Marianne's playing, Ella Lanena interrupted, "Pretty notes won't save you from ruin, child. Discipline will." That night, the piano was closed and never opened again. Outside, the world of 1840 seconds, Georgia thrived on illusion. The great planters dined on silver, quoted scripture, and traded souls. Newspapers praised progress while printing advertisements for auctions. Ministers blessed both baptism and bondage in the same breath. In that world, Ella Lanena felt perfectly at home. She did not invent its cruelty, she only refined it. But the cracks began with silence. One August evening, as the sun sank behind the magnolia trees, she stood alone on the veranda, the air thick with the hum of cicadas. The overseer approached with the day's tallies, bales picked, rations distributed, a note about a new arrival from Virginia. She took the paper without glancing up. "Leave it," she said. "I'll review it later." That night, she opened the record book and traced a name with her fingertip. Asterisk asterisk. Josiah, age 28, sold from Richmond, literate, field strength, exceptional, asterisk, asterisk. She paused. Literacy among the enslaved was rare, dangerous, even forbidden. It made men harder to control, but something about that single word times, literate times, struck her like a spark. She closed the ledger, stared into the fire, and whispered, "Strength and understanding." The candle guttered, throwing long shadows across the room. In its flicker, her husband's portrait seemed to move, his painted eyes glinting with approval. Outside, thunder rolled over the distant hills, a low, trembling sound, like a warning that went unheard. From that night forward, Elelanina began to ask questions about the new man from Virginia, where he slept, what work he did, whether he obeyed without complaint. Her tone was calm, almost clinical, when she questioned Ruth, the old house servant. "Is he obedient?" "Yes, ma'am." "Does he speak much?" "No, ma'am, only when spoken to." "And is he strong?" Ruth hesitated, eyes on the floor. "Stronger than most, ma'am." Elelanina's lips curved faintly. "Good. I prefer strength." That night, Ruth went back to her quarters and crossed herself. The mistress got her eye on that tall one. She whispered to another woman, "Ain't no good come of that." By the next morning, every cabin knew the rumor. Some prayed for the man, others pitied him. A few said he'd caught the devil's attention. At dawn, Elelanina stepped onto her balcony, her white gown stirring in the humid breeze. Below, hundreds bent to the fields, their backs shining with sweat. Among them, she found him, the tall one, moving steadily, rhythmically, as if the world's weight could not break him. She watched for a long time, expression unreadable. To anyone else, it might have looked like idle curiosity. But those who knew her, the daughters who feared her silence, the servants who studied her moods, felt something darker stirring. It wasn't pity. It wasn't desire. It was intent. And when Elelanina Whitfield fixed her intent on something, no force on heaven or earth had ever stopped her. Asterisk. The woman who ruled like a queen had found her new subject, and the seeds of a curse had begun to take root beneath the Georgia. Sunday, asterisk. They said he came down the great wagon road in chains, though the road had long since turned to rails and riverboats. In truth, Josiah's journey from Virginia to Georgia was stitched together by every artery of the domestic trade depots that smelled of salt, pork, and fear, warehouses where men were numbered before they were named, and the dark bellies of packet boats that slid along brown water like coffin lids. By the time he reached Whitfield land, the tobacco dust of Richmond had been replaced by the red clay of Georgia, and the last letters of his old life had been rubbed thin in his pocket, like a prayer pressed too hard. He was tall enough that overseers marked him in ledgers as if height itself could be harvested. The muscles across his shoulders spoke in a language. Planters understood profit, and the quiet in his eyes spoke in a language they did not. He could read enough of scripture to find the verses that contradicted the world around him, and that private defiance, folded small and hidden, made him dangerous in ways numbers could not measure. When he stepped onto the Whitfield place, the fields paused to take his weight. He learned the rows with an economy born from hunger. Water at dawn, pick through the white heat, keep your breath steady, never meet a man's gaze longer than the lash could travel. He spoke when necessary, and even then, never more than the world required. A man like that becomes a rumor before he becomes a memory. The cabins were humming with him by nightfall. "Virginia," the men said, nodding like the state was a story you carried in your bones. "Reeds," the women added, half hopeful, half afraid. "Better keep that inside." Ruth, the old servant of the big house, watched him from a doorway and felt something ancient stir, a mixture of pride and dread that mothers know when they see a tall sun rise in a land that cuts tall suns down. "Mind the mistress," she told him in passing, voice low, eyes lower. "Mind the weather too. Heat like this makes people do crooked things." He inclined his head in thanks. He could not afford to speak. The calendar rolled toward September with the indifference of a millstone. Cotton bowls rattled and popped. The air grew so heavy even the cicadas seemed to drag their songs. On one such day, the overseer Burke rode up to Josiah and let his horse drink shade over him. "You," Burke said, tugging at a glove. "The big house wants you. Lighter work." He smiled in a way that was not a smile. "Congratulations. Lighter work is a phrase that sounds like mercy until you've lived under it. In the cabins, lighter work meant you were being moved from one danger to another, closer to white eyes, closer to whims you couldn't predict and punishments you could. Men had vanished into big houses and reappeared, changed. Some reappeared not at all. Josiah swallowed the iron taste in his throat and nodded once. He had learned years ago that survival begins with the smallest motions. The main house introduced itself as a judgment. White columns, white paint, white dresses drifting like ghosts across polished floors. A whiteness that insisted on virtue, even while it bled you. Josiah learned its arteries quickly: kitchen to pantry, pantry to parlor, parlor to the long hall whose portraits watched like magistrates. He mended a shutter that screamed in the wind. He replaced a stair tread that complained under dainty feet. He reset a pane in a window that looked toward the cotton, so the mistress could gaze upon her kingdom without a flaw to catch her eye. The first time he stood within that eye, it was by design. Ella Lanina Whitfield sat at the veranda in the indigo hour before night, the sky still holding heat like a secret. Her dress was pale as the columns, her hair drawn back so severely it seemed even grief had been pinned into obedience. She did not look up when he approached. "You are Josiah," she said, as if she were naming him. "Yes, Mum. I have been told you are strong." She folded her fan, and obedient. He said nothing. Strength could be named by any fool with eyes. Obedience was a word that courted traps. "You will work under my direction," she went on. "There are repairs that require precision. The overseer will report to me." Her gaze cool, measuring slid over him the way a surveyor's chain slides over land. She was not looking at a man. She was calculating an answer. He felt the old fury rise, then bury itself again where it lived, a coal banked under ash. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Behind the veranda's lace curtains, daughters hovered like moths near a lamp. The eldest, Marianne, stared with a kind of stricken clarity. To her, the shape of it was sudden and complete, her mother's interest arriving like a storm front you could smell before you could see. She did not yet know what form that storm would take, but the air itself had turned metallic on her tongue. Ruth found Josiah afterward in the narrow corridor behind the pantry, where the house exhaled its heat. She pressed a bowl of stew into his hands and did not look at his face. "They'll say it's favor," she whispered. "It ain't. It's a rope with silk on it. Don't lean on it." He ate with the careful slowness of a man measuring time. "I know what things cost," he said softly. He thought of Virginia then, not maps and borders, but a woman's laugh in the kitchen steam, a small hand pulling at his thumb, a name caught in his throat like a fishbone, because names were the first thing taken when you were sold. The house accepted him, as it accepts any moving part unremarked upon unless it fails. Days fell into the newfound pattern. He replaced a cracked sill in a daughter's room, kept his eyes on the wood grain while the girl sat very still on a chair, hands folded, fear bright in her face like fever. He lowered a chandelier by hand and polished its prisms until light itself seemed multiplied, the room breaking into rainbow shards that refused to touch the corners. He hauled logs for the study and set them just so in the grate while the mistress wrote in her black book, pen scratching with the rhythm of a hive. He was near enough to see the pages, once columns of names, tallies like rosary beads, and beneath them lines in a finer, neater hand, aphorisms about strength and legacy. Asterisk. Our line must not weaken. Asterisk. Asterisk. Purity is providence. Asterisk. He did not linger. Language makes a gravity of its own. You can feel its pull even when you do not read the words. On a clear afternoon, as he nailed down a new shingle on the roof, he looked across the world from a height he was not often permitted. The fields rolled like a bleached ocean, the cabins crouched at the edge like a string of punctuation marks no one read aloud. And beyond that, between the trees, the river flashed silver and fast, a moving road with no overseer. Down below, Marianne stepped out from the shade and shielded her eyes to watch him. The tilt of her face was not the tilt her mother used. It held no hunger to possess. It was the angle a person uses to measure a distance they intend to cross. She did not call up to him. Words would have been a trespass neither of them could afford, but she stood there long enough that he felt the gaze as a warmth across his ribs. He finished his work without hurry, set the hammer down, and climbed. When he reached the ground, she was gone. The grass held the memory of her skirt, like a ripple holds wind. That evening, the overseer passed Josiah in the back hall and bumped his shoulder, the way a man tests another man's bones. "Don't get ideas," Burke muttered. "The mistress uses tools till they break." Josiah stepped aside, let the man's breath go past him like rot. There were ideas he did not have to get. They had been given to him long ago by lashing and solitude and the map of scars across his back. He had learned how to be steel wrapped in cloth, how to let the blow hit what it could not dent. At supper, the daughters ate with their eyes on their plates, while the mistress maintained her serene court. Ruth moved silently among them, replacing bread like a sacrament. From the pantry doorway, Josiah saw the shape of a family bent around an absence, Thomas Whitfield's chair polished and empty. A ghost that sat at the head of the table every night and demanded offerings in the form of obedience. Ella Lanina lifted her glass and held it up to the candle so the flame gilded the rim. "To strength," she said. The girls echoed, small and obedient. Ruth's hand shook. A single drop of wine fell to the cloth like blood, and no one wiped it. That night, as the house settled into its careful quiet, Josiah sat on the step outside the quarters under a sky furred with stars and thought about roads. He had followed them to this place, and he had seen what happened to men who ran before they had a place to run to. The South had its own methods for teaching despair. Dogs that learned your scent better than you knew your name, men on horses who made sport of your terror, signs nailed to trees that turned your face into a bounty. He rubbed his thumb across the pad of his forefinger, found the scar there he used as a compass, and prayed the sort of prayer that sounds like breathing. Inside the big house, a candle burned late in the study. Ella Lanina's shadow leaned long and thin across the wall, bending as she wrote. She stopped once, as if hearing a voice that no one else could hear, and looked toward the window. Her lips shaped a single word, no name, just a claim. In the kitchen, Ruth blew out her lamp and stood a moment in the darkness, listening to the house, listening to itself. "Lord," she said finally, "turn her eyes to stone or turn them away." It was not a prayer for mercy. Mercy takes time. It was a prayer for interruption. But the next morning, the orders came down in a voice cool as a porcelain bowl. "Josiah," said the mistress, not raising her eyes from the journal, "you will report to me directly." He felt every story he had ever been told about favors and ropes and silk and silence gather around his ankles like water. He said the only safe words a man in his position could say, each one a rung on a ladder that might be nailed to the wall or pulled away without warning. "Yes, ma'am." "Good," she murmured, and finally looked up at him. The look was not long. It did not need to be. A nail does not need to examine the hammer to understand what comes next. By sundown, the rumor had joined the bread in every cabin. The mistress had found an interest to nurse. Some crossed themselves, some spat to the left. Marianne lay awake in a room that smelled of starch and lemon water, staring at the ceiling where moonlight broke into squares. From somewhere out in the dark, a whippoorwill called once, twice, and then stopped as if it had said too much already. The road had begun to slope. No one could say where it led yet, only that feet had been set upon it, and the night was coming on fast. The sun rose slow and swollen that morning, pressing its weight across the plantation like a fever that would not break. The air shimmered with the heavy perfume of magnolia and sweat, and the sound of cicadas filled the silence between orders barked and footsteps measured. To most, it was another day of labor. To Josiah, it marked the first day he became part of the house, that place of mirrors and masks, where danger wore lace instead of chains. When he crossed the threshold, the smell hit him first, beeswax polish, old books, the faint sweetness of roses cut too long ago. The big house was a different kind of prison, one that trapped its victims in silence rather than iron. Ruth followed a step behind him, her face set in a stillness. He recognized the stillness of people who know that words can kill faster than whips. "Mind the silver," she murmured, "and mind your eyes." He nodded. A man could survive most things if he learned to see without staring. The house staff moved like ghosts through narrow corridors. Every sound seemed to echo the clink of china, the swish of skirts, the soft rhythm of Josiah's boots against the wooden floor. He could feel the eyes of portraits tracking him, long-dead Whitfields in powdered wigs, their faces pale as candle smoke. The mistress sat in the parlor when he entered. Morning light poured through the tall windows, painting her in gold. She did not look up immediately. Instead, she wrote in that black journal again, the one Ruth had whispered about. Her hand moved like clockwork, precise, relentless, cold. "Josiah," she said finally, her voice calm as polished glass. "Yes, ma'am. I want the roof above the west parlor repaired by evening. The last man I sent fell and broke his arm." He inclined his head. "I'll see to it." Her eyes rose to meet his pale gray, sharp enough to cut glass. "See that you do. I expect perfection." It wasn't the words that unsettled him, it was the way she said them. As if perfection were not a goal, but a kind of worship. Outside, as he climbed the roof with hammer and nails, the house groaned beneath him like an old creature resisting touch. The air burned against his skin. Below, the overseer Burke watched from the shade, chewing a straw, his face twisted into a grin too wide to be human. "Careful up there, boy," he called. "Wouldn't want the lady's favorite to fall." Josiah didn't answer. Words spent on men like Burke were wasted breath. When he finished, sweat pouring into his eyes, he saw movement below, a flicker of white among the magnolias. The eldest daughter, Marianne, had stepped out into the light. Her dress was pale, almost luminous, and she shaded her face to look up at him. Their eyes met a moment, no longer than a heartbeat, but something passed between them. Not longing, not yet, but recognition, the quiet understanding shared between two souls caught in someone else's design. She turned quickly and vanished into the shade. That evening, when Josiah brought word that the roof was done, the mistress sat again in her study. The air was thick with candle smoke and the smell of ink. Her daughters were seated nearby, pretending to sew, though none of them could keep their hands from trembling. Elalina lifted her eyes to Josiah. "You work well," she said. "Better than most." "Thank you, Mom. Tell me," she continued, "do you believe in destiny?" He hesitated. "I believe a man makes what he can from what's given." Her mouth curved faintly. "And if what's given is divine?" He met her gaze for the first time, and though his voice was quiet, it carried through the room. Then God would not give one man another's chains. The air thickened. One of the daughters dropped her needle, the sound sharp as a crack of thunder. Elalina's expression did not change, but her eyes, those grey eyes, turned cold as a winter river. "You are bold," she said finally. "No, ma'am," Josiah replied softly, "just honest." That night, in the servants' quarters, Ruth brought him supper, bread, beans, and a look that carried both fear and pity. "You should have bit your tongue," she whispered. "Pride don't feed a man. It feeds the fire that burns him." Josiah nodded but said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was a weapon too, one that left no scars but cut just as deep. Meanwhile, inside the big house, the daughters whispered behind closed doors. "She's watching him," said Louise. "Mother?" "Yes, like she used to watch father before the fever took him." The younger girls shuddered, remembering the nights when their mother had sat up praying to a God that never answered. Marianne said nothing. She simply listened, her heart pounding with the knowledge that something unnatural had begun. The next day, Elalina changed the household routine. Josiah was ordered to work within the main building, fixing railings, carrying firewood, repairing a door that didn't need repair. Each task drew him closer. Each excuse kept him longer. The servants watched in silence. They had seen this pattern before, not in this house, but on others. A powerful white mistress and a chosen man from the fields. Sometimes it ended in whispers, sometimes in blood. By midweek, Josiah was told to tend the parlor fire. When he entered, Elalina was waiting, her daughters absent. The room glowed with amber light, her shadow long against the wall. "Do you ever think of freedom?" she asked. He froze. No one in her position had ever spoken that word aloud. "I think of work," he said carefully. "Work," she echoed, leaning closer. "That's all you think about?" He looked into the flames. "It's safer than dreaming." Her hand brushed the mantle, fingers pale as bone. "Dreams are what build dynasties, Josiah. The Whitfields were made from dreams." He said nothing, and she seemed to take his silence as permission. "My husband was weak," she murmured. "He gave this land its wealth, but not its future. I mean to correct that." Her tone was almost tender, but there was something fevered beneath it, the kind of faith that bends men to its will. She turned toward him then, so close he could feel the heat of the fire on both their faces. "You have strength," she said softly, "and strength must serve purpose." For the first time, he looked at her, really looked. The woman who claimed to rule by divine right was nothing but bone, silk, and madness bound together by pride. And for a fleeting second, pity stirred in him, pity for a soul that mistook control for salvation. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," he said, voice low but steady. "Strength don't belong to just one house. It belongs to God." The words landed like stones. Her face changed, just slightly, a tightening of the jaw, a flicker of wounded vanity. "You will remember your place," she said coldly. "I do, ma'am," he replied. "Every hour of every day." He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him at the door. "From now on," she said, "you will take your meals here near the kitchen. I want you close at hand." He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am." As he stepped out into the hallway, Ruth was waiting. She had heard enough to know what it meant. Her hands shook as she pressed a cloth into his palm. "You can't fight thunder, boy," she whispered. "You just pray it passes." That night, the storm broke for real. Rain hammered the roof, wind screamed through the fields, and lightning flashed across the horizon like torn paper. Inside her study, Elelanina sat by the window, watching the dark. Her daughters slept fitfully in their rooms, and down in the quarters, Ruth knelt by her bed, whispering prayers meant to hold back evil. Only Josiah did not sleep. He sat upright on his cot, staring at the door, hearing every creak of the house above him, the sound of a queen without a king, dreaming of creation, and the first low rumble of a curse beginning to stir in the walls. By the time autumn burned the edges of the fields to gold, Josiah had become a shadow within the walls of the great house. He was everywhere and nowhere at once, the silent figure that carried wood, polished silver, fixed what broke, and disappeared before anyone could thank him. To the Whitfield daughters, he was a ghost who walked by daylight. To the servants, he was a man walking a tightrope stretched above a pit no one could name aloud. But to Elelanina Whitfield, he had become an idea. Her obsession grew quietly, like ivy creeping across brick. The more she saw of Josiah, his steadiness, his refusal to tremble before her, the deeper she convinced herself that God had sent him. Asterisk, not as temptation, asterisk, she told herself in the long hours after midnight, asterisk, but as proof, asterisk, strength was divine. And she, who had buried her husband and borne the burden of the Whitfield legacy, deserved to harness it. It was Marianne who first noticed the change in her mother's eyes. The grey had turned to silver, a light too sharp to be human. She avoided the study where that black leather journal sat open on the desk, its pages filled with words that no one else was allowed to read. Once, when the wind caught a page as she passed by, she saw a single phrase written again and again. Asterisk, purity is power, power must be preserved. Asterisk, at supper that evening, the air in the dining room was thick enough to drown in. The table gleamed with silver cutlery and crystal glasses. Candles burned low, their wax spilling like tears. The daughters sat in silence, eyes fixed on their plates. Across from them, the widow presided like a judge, her posture perfect, her voice soft and slow. "Burke," she said to the overseer standing at the far end of the table, "bring Josiah from the kitchen. I want him to serve tonight." The daughters stiffened. Burke hesitated. "Yes, ma'am," he said finally, and left the room. A few moments later, Josiah entered, carrying a tray of wine and fresh bread. He could feel the weight of their eyes before he looked up. The youngest girls stared at him with fear thinly veiled as curiosity. Marianne's hands clenched in her lap. Elelanina's gaze, steady and unblinking, followed his every movement. He poured the wine carefully, the dark liquid catching the candlelight like blood. "Strong hands," Elelanina murmured, watching the way his fingers wrapped around the decanter. "Hands that could shape destiny." The words hung in the air like smoke. Marianne's spoon slipped from her grasp, clattering against her plate. No one spoke. Even the fire seemed to quiet. "Is something wrong, my dear?" Elelanina asked without turning her head. Marianne swallowed hard. "No, mother." But her mother's eyes lingered too long, her tone too smooth, her smile too cold. After dinner, Elelanina dismissed everyone except Josiah. "You will stay," she said. "I have work for you." The daughters froze mid-step. They exchanged looks of disbelief. Even Burke hesitated by the door, as if waiting for permission to intervene. "That will be all, Mr. Burke," the widow said, her voice hardening. "Go." When the doors closed, silence took the room again. Josiah stood motionless, waiting. Ella Lenina moved to the mantel, tracing her gloved fingers along the frame of her husband's portrait. "Do you know what this house cost me?" she asked quietly. "How many prayers, how many promises?" Josiah said nothing. He knew better than to answer questions that weren't meant to be answered. "I built this empire from ashes," she continued. "My husband left me nothing but his name, and I intend to make that name immortal." She turned toward him now, eyes glinting with firelight. "Do you believe in blood, Josiah, in legacy?" He met her gaze evenly. "I believe in the Lord, ma'am, not in blood." Her expression flickered, then hardened. "You think me wicked, perhaps?" He shook his head. "I think you're lost." For a heartbeat, something human crossed her face, a wound, old and unhealed, but pride smothered it as quickly as it came. "You will do as I say," she replied, her tone icy. "This house gave you life, shelter, purpose. Everything you are belongs to it." Josiah's jaw tightened. His voice, when it came, was quiet but firm. "No, ma'am, you own my body, not my soul." The words were simple, yet when they struck the air, they felt like thunder. Ella Lenina's lips parted, but no sound came. She stared at him as if seeing something she couldn't comprehend, defiance wrapped in calm, strength without violence. Finally, she whispered, "Leave me." Josiah bowed his head and turned to go. When the door closed behind him, the widow's composure shattered. She reached for the journal on her desk, scribbling furiously across the page. Asterisk. "Obedience is a man's duty. Defiance is disease." Asterisk. Her pen tore the paper. The candlelight trembled. Outside the study, Ruth waited in the hall. When Josiah stepped out, she caught his arm. What did she want? He shook his head. "Something I can't give." Ruth's eyes darkened. "Then you best start praying she don't take it anyway." Down the corridor, behind the cracked door of their room, the daughters huddled in whispers. "She's losing her mind," Louise said, trembling. "Did you see the way she looked at him?" "She's dangerous," whispered Clara. But Marianne said nothing. She stared into the dark, listening to the wind rise outside, hearing the first drops of rain against the glass. That night, Ella Lenina Whitfield wrote until dawn. The ink ran thin, her hand unsteady, her words drifting from reason into revelation. On one page she scrawled, "Asterisk. A new line must be born from strength. The vessel is chosen." Asterisk. In the stillness that followed, she sat back, eyes burning, lips parted as if she'd heard the voice of God himself. Outside, the rain stopped. The first morning light crept through the curtains. Somewhere beyond the fields, a crow cawed once long, low, and hollow, and down in the cabins, Ruth woke from a dream of fire. "Something's coming," she whispered to no one. "Something we can't stop." The days that followed were a study in unease. Even the air seemed to hesitate before crossing the threshold of the Whitfield house. Meals were taken in silence. The daughters moved as though the floors were glass. The servants, normally a whispering tide of motion, learned to disappear. Work was done before dawn. Footsteps softened, voices swallowed. Only the mistress appeared unchanged, composed, deliberate, eyes too bright. It was as if she had made a private treaty with the storm gathering inside her. Each night, after the house folded into stillness, she lit the lamps in her late husband's study. Firelight sculpted her face into something beautiful and terrible. She would sit before his portrait and speak in tones that belonged to prayer, but not to God. "You left a house of daughters," she murmured. "You left it to rot. But I will give you sons in spirit, if not in name. I will perfect what you began." The flames wavered, catching in her eyes until they looked made of molten glass. Marianne began to avoid that end of the corridor, yet the sound of her mother's voice found her anyway, slipping under doors and into dreams. When sleep did come, it was filled with images she couldn't name, hands reaching through smoke, the smell of iron and rain, the taste of fear. Once she woke to find her own reflection trembling in the mirror, as if someone had touched the glass from the other side. She told herself it was imagination. Everyone did. But the house had started to listen. The chandeliers swayed when there was no wind. Doors opened to rooms that had been locked. Even the walls seemed to breathe when the candles burned low. Downstairs, Josiah kept to his new duties. The hammer and saw had given way to polish and cloth. He mended what already gleamed, stacked wood that did not need stacking. The labor was useless by design, a chain disguised as privilege. He spoke little, but Ruth watched the lines around his mouth deepen. "You look like a man holding thunder in his chest," she said one evening as she set down a plate of bread. He almost smiled. "Thunder don't break easy," he replied, "but it does find a place to strike." The next morning, Ella called her daughters into the parlor. Light slanted through tall windows, the dust motes turning like tiny planets. "My dears," she began, "a family is only as strong as its obedience." Her voice was soft, but the silence that followed it was absolute. "You will remain near the house for the coming weeks. Lessons, prayers, rest. There will be no visits, no letters." Louise opened her mouth, then closed it. Marianne managed to ask, "Is something wrong?" Their mother smiled, slow, deliberate. "No, child. Everything is finally as it should be." That night, Ella descended the stairs in a robe of grey silk, a candle held high. The flame flickered across the marble floor, across her daughter's portraits lined up like saints on a chapel wall. She paused before Marianne's likeness and touched the painted cheek. "So much grace," she whispered, "but where is your father's strength?" Then she turned, eyes finding the window that looked toward the cabins. In the distance, a single lantern glowed the light from Ruth's quarters, where hymns were being sung under breath. "Pray all you like," she said aloud. Prayer never stopped creation. Out in the yard, Josiah was walking the perimeter, checking shutters against the coming wind. The night was thick with the smell of rain. When lightning flashed, he saw her standing at the window, a pale shape behind the glass, watching. For a long moment neither moved, then the light vanished, leaving only the echo of it behind his eyes. Later, in the quiet, Marianne found him near the well. "You shouldn't be out," he said softly. She shook her head. "She's changing." Her voice was barely more than air. "It's like she hears something none of us can hear." He looked toward the dark horizon where thunder flickered. "Maybe she does," he said. "The question is who's speaking back." Marianne caught his sleeve. "Promise me you'll stay away from her." He didn't answer. There are promises a man cannot make when every path is already marked by another's command. Instead, he said, "You need to keep your sisters close. Whatever she's building, it's not meant for light." When she returned inside, the smell of smoke met her halfway up the stairs. The fire in the study had grown wild, licking out of the hearth. Her mother stood before it, head tipped back, hands lifted. "Do you feel it?" Ella cried to no one visible, the blood answering the call. The sight froze Marianne where she stood. In that instant, her mother looked not human but carved from devotion and fury. The shadows bent toward her, as if pulled by gravity. "Mother," Marianne whispered, "please stop." Ella turned, her face caught between rapture and rage. "Stop," she echoed. "You speak of stopping as though this were sin. This is salvation." She took a step closer, the fire behind her throwing long shapes across the walls. "Do you want this family to fade into dust? To be pitied by the world that feeds on us?" Marianne shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "I want us to live," she said, "not like this." The older woman laughed, low and bitter. "Weakness has a woman's voice," she said, and swept past her daughter, the scent of burning oil following like a veil. The door slammed, leaving Marianne staring into the flames until her own reflection wavered inside them. She did not sleep, neither did Josiah. He lay awake on his narrow cot, hearing the storm advance, counting the seconds between lightning and thunder. With every flash he saw the house outlined against the sky, white, immense, and already half-ruined in spirit. Somewhere within its walls, he imagined the widow writing in her journal, her pen-etching commandments meant to outlive them all. Just before dawn, Ruth appeared at his door. Her shawl was soaked, her eyes hollow. "She's fixing to do something," she said. "I can feel it in my bones, like when a dog goes quiet before a quake." Josiah stood, pulling on his shirt. "Then it's near," he said. "And when it comes, we'll have to choose whether to run or to stand." Ruth looked at him a long moment. "If you stand," she whispered, "you won't stand alone." Above them, a window flung open and banged against its frame. From within the house came the sound of a single chord struck hard on the piano, the same instrument locked away years ago. The note hung, sour and defiant, before fading back into the storm. By sunrise, The Whitfield plantation was awake to something it could not name. The air itself had changed. Even the birds refused to sing. And inside, the mistress of the house, hair unbound, face pale with triumph, smiled into her mirror as if seeing revelation made flesh. "The line will be perfected," she whispered, "before the next moon rises." The mirror trembled. A fine crack split its surface, running straight down the reflection of her eyes. The following week arrived, wrapped in stillness, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Even the workers in the fields felt it, the tension that seeped from the great house and spread like humidity, thick and invisible. Conversations stopped when doors opened. No one lingered near the veranda anymore. They said the mistress had turned the mirrors to face the walls and burned the family Bible, but no one dared to ask why. Eleanor Whitfield appeared at breakfast one morning dressed in white. It wasn't the soft ivory of mourning she'd worn for years, but a blinding, ceremonial white that shimmered when she moved. Her daughters sat in silence, each one waiting for the next to speak. When none did, she smiled faintly. "Girls," she said, "I've made a decision. This family will take a new portrait." Marianne frowned. "A portrait?" "Yes. A reminder to the world that the Whitfields endure." Her eyes flicked from one face to the next, studying them like objects. "You'll each have new gowns made, white pure, matching. We'll stand together as one, as destiny intended." Louise tried to protest, but the words tangled in her throat. Only Marianne spoke. "Mother, people are talking already. If we let them talk." Eleanina's voice cut through the air like the snap of a whip. "The world always mocks what it cannot understand." The matter was closed. The gowns were ordered by noon. That night, the sewing room filled with lamplight and the soft rasp of scissors. The air smelled of starch and linen. The daughters worked until their fingers bled, afraid to do otherwise. Marianne pricked her thumb and watched the blood bead against the white fabric. It looked too bright, too alive. Outside, thunder muttered far off over the pines. The season of storms had begun again. When Ruth brought water to the room, she paused in the doorway. "All white," she whispered, shaking her head. "Ain't no wedding and ain't no funeral. What kind of ceremony needs dresses like that?" Marianne looked up. "A ceremony? That's what it sounds like," Ruth said. She told the cook to keep candles by the dozen and clear the parlor of furniture. The girls exchanged glances. The word times, ceremony times, hung in the air like a chill. Marianne felt it settle in her bones. A few nights later, the eldest found herself once again unable to sleep. The storm had moved closer. The rain against her window came in fits and starts, and with each flash of lightning she saw the faint outline of the cotton fields beyond the rows like scars across the land. She left her room quietly and descended the back stairs. In the kitchen, she found Ruth humming a low tune, stirring a pot over the dying embers of the fire. "Ruth," she whispered, "I need to know something. Why does she look at him like that?" The old woman's spoon paused mid-stir. "Because he's the only thing she can't control, child. And she's a woman who's built her whole life on control. She means to use him," Marianne said. It wasn't a question. Ruth's eyes filled with something heavy and sorrowful. "I've been around long enough to see where them kinds of eyes lead. Don't matter if the owner's man or woman, they always end in ruin. You hear me? Ruin." Marianne nodded. "Then someone has to stop her." Ruth set down the spoon. "And who's gonna stop a woman who thinks she's got God on her side?" The question hung between them until a gust of wind burst through the shutters, sending the fire's embers scattering across the floor. They both startled. Ruth crossed herself. "That house," she murmured, "ain't got room for all them ghosts she's calling." The next morning, the mistress summoned Josiah to the veranda again. The sky was clean after the storm, the air so bright it hurt to breathe. Eleanina sat in her high-backed chair, fanning herself lazily. Beside her stood one of the new gowns, half-finished, draped across a mannequin. Its whiteness seemed to defy the earth itself. "You've been here a long time now," she said, eyes following a bead of sweat down his neck. "Tell me, Josiah, do you know what it means to be chosen?" He kept his gaze low. "Can't say I do, Mum. It means purpose, providence." She smiled faintly. "It means you were born for something greater than yourself." He said nothing. Silence was safer than blasphemy. Eleanina's fan stopped. "I've prayed for a sign," she said, "and I believe God has sent one in you." He looked up then, just enough to meet her eyes. What he saw there froze him. It wasn't lust nor pity, but conviction, the kind of belief that had built empires and burned them down. "With respect, ma'am," he said carefully, "I think you're hearing your own voice, not his." Her hand lowered slowly. The fan closed with a sound like a blade snapping shut. "You forget yourself." He shook his head. "No, ma'am, I remember too much." For a moment, they stood locked in silence, the air trembling between them. Then she turned away, dismissing him with a flick of her wrist. "Go," she said. "You'll be called when you're needed." He bowed his head and left, though every instinct in him screamed to run farther than the horizon would allow. That evening, Marianne found Josiah behind the barn, mending a wooden yoke. The fading light made his skin shine with sweat and sawdust. She waited until he looked up. "She's planning something," she said. "Something with those dresses." "I know. You should leave," she whispered. "If you stay." He straightened, eyes calm but hard. "Where would I go? The dogs, the men with rifles, they'd have me dead before sunrise. A man like me don't just leave. He vanishes." Marianne swallowed. "Then I'll help you vanish." The words escaped her before she could stop them. For the first time, he smiled not with joy, but with a kind of gentle sorrow. "You don't owe me that." "No," she said, "but I owe her the truth. She's lost Josiah, and if she keeps going, she'll drag us all into hell with her." The sound of thunder cracked in the distance again, closer now. He looked toward the darkening sky. "Then we best be ready when hell arrives." In the main house, Ella Lenina stood before a long mirror, studying her reflection. The candlelight painted her face in gold and shadow. Behind her, the 5 white dresses hung in a row like waiting spirits. Her lips moved silently, repeating something over and over, until it became a prayer or a curse, perhaps both. The blood must mix, the line must be renewed. She touched the glass with her fingertips, and for an instant, her reflection didn't move. That night, the thunder rolled low over the land, steady and patient, like something gathering strength. And somewhere between heaven and earth, the first cracks in the Whitfield legacy began to show. The storm had passed, but the air it left behind was stranger than silence. The Whitfield house sat beneath a sky the color of pewter, its windows gleaming like unblinking eyes. Every creak of the floor, every sigh of the wind through the shutters seemed to speak in a language of warning. The servants felt it, the daughters felt it, and Marianne, who could no longer remember when she'd last slept, felt it most of all. That evening, she waited until the house had gone still. The candles in the hallway burned low, the wax crawling down their stems like melting bones. She carried no light of her own. She didn't need to. She knew the path to her mother's study by heart, the stretch of hallway that always seemed colder than the rest, the sharp scent of ink and smoke that seeped through the door like breath. The knob turned easily. Her mother had not locked it. Inside, the room glowed with a faint, unnatural light. The black journal lay open on the desk, as if it had been waiting. Marianne hesitated, her pulse hammering in her throat. She had told herself she only wanted to see it to prove that her fears were just that, fears. But as she drew closer, the words on the open page pulled her like gravity. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, each letter cut into the paper with such pressure the ink bled through. "Is greater than asterisk. The seed must be chosen, the vessel must obey. The Whitfield line will be renewed in strength and sanctity. Asterisk." Marianne's stomach turned. She flipped to another page, then another. The further she read, the worse it became. "Is greater than asterisk. Purity is a gift of blood. The hand of God does not tremble. Asterisk is greater than asterisk. He will not resist. If he does, he will learn obedience through sacrifice. Asterisk." Her fingers shook. The candle on the desk sputtered as if the air itself rejected the words. She turned one more page and froze. At the top, in her mother's perfect script, was a name. Asterisk, asterisk, Josiah, asterisk, asterisk. Beneath it, a single sentence written in smaller, faster strokes. "Is greater than asterisk. He is the key. My daughters will bear greatness." Asterisk. A sound caught in her throat. It wasn't quite a gasp, it was something more primal, the noise a trapped bird makes when it realizes there's no way out. She slammed the book shut and stumbled back, her shoulder hitting the desk. The candle fell, sputtering against the floor. For a moment, everything went dark. Then the voice came. Marianne. Her mother stood in the doorway, the faint light from the hall outlining her in gold and shadow. Her face was calm, too calm. "You've been reading what doesn't belong to you." Marianne's mouth went dry. "What is this?" she managed to whisper. "What are you doing?" Elalanina stepped into the room. "What I must," she said. "What God demands." "God?" Marianne's voice cracked. "You think he wants this? You think he told you to?" Her mother's hand moved so quickly she never saw it coming. The slap was sharp, echoing through the room. For a second, everything stopped: the storm outside, the whispering trees, even Marianne's breathing. "You will not question me," Elalanina said. Her voice was calm again, but her eyes were fever, bright. "You are too young to understand what sacrifice means." Marianne pressed a hand to her burning cheek. "I understand enough," she said. "You've lost yourself." A faint smile touched Elalanina's lips. "No, child, I've found myself, and soon, so will you." She turned, gathering the journal and placing it gently into the drawer of her desk. "Go to bed," she said without looking up. "Tomorrow begins the future." Marianne didn't move. "You can't mean to go through with this," she whispered. Her mother's voice came, soft and distant. "It's already begun." That night, Marianne did not return to her room. She fled to the kitchen instead, heart pounding, feet bare against the cold stone floor. Ruth was there, kneeling beside the stove, praying under her breath. When she saw the girl, she knew. "She's gone too far," Marianne said, trembling. "She's writing about him, about Josiah. She says it's God's will." Ruth stood, gripping her by the shoulders. "Hush now," she said, though her own voice shook. "You keep your voice low. Walls got ears in this house." "I can't just do nothing," Marianne cried. "She'll hurt him. She'll hurt all of us." Ruth's eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. "Then you best find a way out of here, child, before she burns this place down with her madness." Marianne shook her head. "She's my mother." Ruth's gaze hardened. "Not anymore. She ain't." Outside, the wind had risen again, carrying the smell of rain and something else, smoke, faint but growing. In his small quarters by the barn, Josiah woke to it. He sat up, heart thudding, and for a moment he thought the storm had returned. But the thunder he heard wasn't in the sky, it was in his chest. He stepped out into the dark and looked toward the house. The windows were lit, every one of them. Candles burned in every room like eyes staring into the night. And there, behind the highest window, he saw her. Elalanina Whitfield stood before her mirror, the black journal open in her hands. Her lips moved soundlessly, repeating the words over and over. Asterisk. The blood must mix. The line must be renewed. Asterisk. Josiah felt the hair on his arms rise. The air was too still. The night too quiet. It was the kind of quiet the world takes before something breaks. At dawn, Ruth found Marianne asleep at the kitchen table. The candle beside her burned down to nothing. "Wake up, child," she said softly, shaking her shoulder. "You can't be here when she comes down." Marianne blinked, confused. "When who?" But before Ruth could answer, a voice floated down the stairs, measured, smooth, and terrifyingly calm. "Ruth, fetch Josiah." The old woman froze. The air seemed to leave the room. Marianne's eyes widened. "No." Ruth turned toward her, face pale as milk. "It's starting," she whispered. "Lord help us all. It's starting." That morning, the Whitfield house fell silent once more. Only the wind moved, brushing against the white dresses hung in the parlor like waiting ghosts. And upstairs in her study, Elalanina dipped her pen in ink and wrote one final line beneath Josiah's name. "Is greater than asterisk. The vessel is ready, asterisk." The day broke under a bruised sky. Clouds rolled low over the Whitfield plantation, grey as tarnished silver, pressing the air flat and heavy. Even the birds had gone quiet. In the fields, the workers bent low, pretending not to see the strange preparations happening near the big house. Curtains drawn, windows shuttered, servants dismissed before noon, signs of a household sealing itself off from the world. Inside, the walls of the parlor had been stripped bare. Rugs rolled away, furniture dragged to the edges, mirrors covered with white sheets that looked like ghosts standing at attention. At the center of the room, Elalanina Whitfield moved with slow precision, arranging candles in a perfect circle. She wore her own gown of white, simple but radiant in the dim light. Her hair was pinned high, streaks of silver glinting like threads of wire. Ruth stood in the doorway, wringing her hands. "Ma'am," she whispered, "maybe this ain't the day for—" "Enough." Elalanina didn't raise her voice, but the sound of it silenced everything around her. "You've served this family long enough to know when to hold your tongue." Yes, ma'am, Ruth said softly. She backed away, crossing herself as she went. The smell of melted wax and damp air clung to her clothes. In the upstairs hall, Marianne and her sisters stood trembling, dressed in the white gowns their mother had ordered. The fabric scratched against their skin, stiff with starch, stiff with fear. "Why do we have to wear these?" whispered Clara. "Because she said so," Marianne answered, tying the ribbon at her throat. "Do as she says, but don't look at her too long. Don't agree to anything. You hear me?" Louise bit her lip. "Marianne, what's happening?" Marianne took her hand, squeezing hard. "Something wrong," she said. "Something we have to survive." At the stroke of dusk, Elena rang the bell that once called the family to supper. Its tone carried through the house like the toll of a funeral. Josiah came from the kitchen, his face expressionless, his body tense. He had been ordered to bring the final candles to the parlor, but when he entered, he stopped. The air inside felt too thick, too alive. Dozens of flames flickered across the walls, casting the room in a trembling light that made every shape waver. The daughters stood near the edge, pale and silent, their white dresses gleaming. And in the center, Elena waited, hands clasped before her, eyes shining like those of a prophet on the edge of revelation. "Close the door," she said. He obeyed. The sound of it clicking shut was soft, final. "Do you know why you're here, Josiah?" He set the candles down. "To serve, ma'am." A faint smile curved her lips. "Yes, to serve, to fulfill the purpose you were made for." She stepped closer, the hem of her gown whispering across the floor. "You are strength made flesh, and strength must be joined with purity, or it is wasted. The Whitfield name demands endurance. It demands blood that cannot break." Marianne's voice came from behind. "Mother, stop this." "Quiet, child," Elena snapped, without looking away from Josiah. "You'll understand soon enough." Josiah's hands curled into fists at his sides. "I ain't a vessel, ma'am. I'm a man." Her smile didn't fade, but something colder crept into it. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't prayed for a sign of God's will? He sent you, Josiah. He sent you to me." Marianne stepped forward, voice shaking. "He sent no such thing. You're twisting his name into madness." Her mother turned, eyes blazing. "Madness?" she hissed. "No, my daughter. Madness is weakness, pretending to be virtue. This," she gestured to the circle of light around her, "this is creation." She lifted the black journal from a small table, the pages fluttering in the wind that had begun to rise through the chimney. "Read it," she commanded. "Read what destiny looks like." "You won't. Then you'll obey," Elena said, her voice suddenly low, almost tender. "Because you are my blood, and my blood does not defy me." Marianne trembled, but she did not step back. "Then your blood is cursed." For a heartbeat, no one moved. The candles flickered wildly, shadows dancing like spirits across the walls. Then, slow and deliberate, Josiah stepped between them. His presence filled the room like a storm about to break. "Enough," he said quietly. "This house ain't holy, Mum. You talk about God, but he's not here. Only you and your fear." Elena's breath caught. "You dare." He didn't let her finish. "I've seen men think they could own the breath of another. It never ends but one way." Her hands trembled. "You forget who you are." "No," Josiah said. "You forget what you've done." For the first time, Elena faltered. The mask cracked. The queen, the prophet, the savior, all peeled away, leaving a woman who'd lost everything except her need to control it. Marianne reached toward her mother, tears burning her eyes. "Please," she said, "stop before there's nothing left to save." Elena looked at her daughter, really looked, and something broke in her face. "You would betray me," she whispered. "I would save you." Thunder rolled overhead, shaking the windows. One of the curtains tore loose, flaring in the wind. The candles guttered, then went out all at once, plunging the room into darkness. There was a single scream, whether from wind or woman, no one could tell, and then silence. When light returned, a single candle remained burning on the floor, its flame steady and small. Elena stood alone in the circle, staring at Josiah and Marianne as if she was seeing ghosts. "Get out," she said finally, her voice hollow. "Both of you." Neither moved. "I said, get out." The words struck like a blow. Josiah took Marianne's hand and led her from the room. Behind them, they heard her begin to sob, a sound raw, animal, nothing like the woman who had ruled this house. Ruth met them in the hall, eyes wide. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "It's begun, ain't it?" Josiah nodded once. "It's begun." Outside, rain began to fall again, slow and steady. In the distance, lightning split the sky, casting the Whitfield mansion in brief flashes of white. And inside, the mistress of the house stood alone in the circle of melted wax, her hands raised toward heaven, whispering the same line again and again. Asterisk. "The blood must mix. The blood must mix." Asterisk. The storm answered her in thunder. That night, the heavens broke open. Rain came in sheets, hammering the red Georgia soil until it bled mud. The plantation lights guttered and died one by one. The great house groaned under the wind, its shutters flapping like wings of something trying to rise. Inside, servants huddled in their quarters, whispering prayers into the roar. They all felt it. The house had crossed a line no prayer could pull back. Upstairs, Elalina Whitfield paced the hall in her soaked white gown, the hem streaked with soot. The candles had burned themselves to stumps around the parlor's ruined circle. She muttered as she walked, fragments of scripture stitched together with fever. The vessel has fled. The line must not end." Her daughters locked their doors and buried their faces in pillows. Even through the storm, they could hear her voice climbing and falling like a hymn turned inside out. In the kitchen below, Ruth was packing a small bundle bread, a flask of water, the last of the salt pork. Her hands shook as she worked, her old bones screaming at her to move faster. The door creaked open behind her. "Is it time?" she whispered. Josiah stood there, rain slicking his hair, eyes burning with quiet resolve. "It's time." Marianne appeared beside him, barefoot, her nightdress clinging to her from the rain she'd already crossed through. "She knows," she said. "She's coming for us." Ruth pressed the bundle into Josiah's hands. "Then you best not waste another breath. The back door's unlatched. Follow the path past the smokehouse. It'll take you to the woods. The river's swollen, but it'll hide your tracks." Josiah nodded. "You coming?" She shook her head. Somebody's got to stay and bury what's left of her soul. Go. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at one another, the old woman, the runaway, the daughter. Then Josiah took Marianne's hand, and together they slipped into the storm. The night swallowed them whole. The rain stung their faces, the mud clutched their feet. Behind them, lightning struck a tree near the house, and for a moment the plantation glowed white as bone. In that flash, they saw her Elalina standing on the balcony, her gown plastered to her skin, hair unbound and whipping in the wind. She was shouting, but the storm devoured her words. Marianne froze. "She's calling us," she whispered. "No," Josiah said, pulling her forward. "She's calling ghosts." They ran, past the barn, past the fields that had fed on generations of suffering, past the row of cabins now dark and silent. The rain blurred everything into a single grey shape of motion. Josiah's muscles screamed, but he didn't stop. He knew what waited for anyone who hesitated. The dogs, the rifles, the ropes hanging in the shed. Behind them, a bell began to ring. Once, twice, 3 times the overseer's signal. Burke's voice rose above the storm, drunk with rage. "Find them! Run the hounds!" Marianne stumbled. Josiah caught her, lifting her when she fell. The mud pulled at her dress like fingers trying to drag her back. "Don't look behind," he said. "Don't ever look behind." By the time they reached the tree line, the rain had turned to needles. The forest loomed ahead, black and endless. Josiah slowed just long enough to listen. In the distance came the faintest sound, the baying of dogs. The hunt had begun. "We've got a head start," he said, trying to believe it. "We just have to keep moving." "How far?" she asked, panting. "River's an hour if we're lucky." Lightning tore the sky, turning the woods into a maze of white trunks and shadows. They pressed on, stumbling through briars, following the faint glimmer of water through the trees. Every sound felt too loud, the crack of a branch, the catch of a breath, the heartbeat that thundered like a drum. The dogs grew louder. "Go," Josiah urged, dragging her forward. The undergrowth tore at his arms, blood mingling with rain. Somewhere behind, men shouted. The shots came next, sharp, deafening cracks that ripped through the wind. One bullet hissed past his ear and buried itself in a tree. Another struck close enough to spray bark into his face. He turned, eyes catching the faint glow of torches moving through the woods. "They're close," Marianne gasped. He gritted his teeth. "Then we run faster." At last, the trees broke open to the riverbank. The water raged, black and swollen, churning over fallen branches. It looked less like salvation than a beast waiting to devour them. Marianne stared at it, terror in her eyes. "We can't cross that." Josiah turned to her, chest heaving. "If we don't, they'll kill us where we stand." Lightning flashed again, and in that instant he saw them 3 riders on the ridge, rifles raised, their torches throwing hellish halos around their faces. Behind them, the dogs tore through the brush. "Hold on to me," he said. He pulled her into the current. The cold hit like iron. The water clawed at their legs, rising to their waists, then their shoulders. The current dragged hard, spinning them sideways. She screamed as her feet left the ground. "Keep your head up," he shouted, forcing her toward the far bank. "Don't fight it, let it carry you." The world became a chaos of water and thunder. A bullet struck the river near them, sending up a spray that burned his eyes. He kicked harder, pulling her until his arms went numb. The torchlight blurred behind them, swallowed by the storm. And then, in one blinding flash of lightning, Josiah saw her again, Ella Lanena, standing at the edge of the woods, her face ghostly pale against the dark. She made no move to follow. She only watched. The rain streamed down her like tears. Marianne saw her too. For a heartbeat, their eyes met across the distance, the daughter and the mother, divided by the river and everything between them. Then the current took them. They tumbled through the flood, choking, grasping, fighting for air. Josiah's hand slipped from hers once, twice. The third time, he caught her by the wrist and pulled her close. "I got you," he gasped. "Don't let go." She nodded, but her eyes were wide, her lips blue. The water pulled at them like a living thing, dragging them downstream toward the cypress bend where the river split. Josiah reached for a fallen branch, clinging with one arm while keeping her above water. The branch groaned, threatening to break. "Can you climb?" he shouted. Before she could answer, another gunshot echoed through the rain, closer this time. Bark exploded near his head. The branch snapped. They went under. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness and roar, the world reduced to cold and weight. When Josiah surfaced, the river had carried them far from the lights. The riders' torches were distant sparks now, fading. He looked for Marianne, shouting her name. No answer. Then, through the sheets of rain, he saw her pale hand clutching at reeds near the opposite bank. He swam to her, every stroke a battle. When he reached her, she coughed, eyes dazed. "Did we make it?" He looked back across the water. The Whitfield house was only a shadow now, its white columns flashing in the storm like bones under lightning. "We ain't free yet," he said, voice raw, "but we're gone." For a long moment, they simply held each other, breathing, alive. The rain softened, the thunder rolling away into distance. Somewhere, an owl cried a sound both mournful and holy. But the peace didn't last. Downriver, a single hound barked again. Josiah pulled her to her feet. "We move," he said. "We keep to the woods. The river's got more to tell before it's done with us." Behind them, in the ruins of her parlor, Ella Lanena Whitfield knelt among the melted candles, whispering into the dark. Asterisk, the blood must mix, the blood must mix. Asterisk, and outside, the storm carried her voice across the water, thin, broken, and endless. Morning crawled out of the storm like a wounded thing. A pale light spread across the Whitfield plantation, touching every broken thing it found, fallen branches, flooded ditches, the shattered glass of the veranda doors. The air smelled of ash and rain, and from the house there came no movement, no command, no prayer. The overseer, Burke, returned with 2 riders at first light, their dogs exhausted and trembling. "Tracks end at the river," one man said, spitting into the mud. Burke stared at the rushing water, his face grey. "No one crosses that alive," he muttered, and ordered the dogs turned loose. By noon he was gone, leaving the house behind him like a carcass picked clean. Inside, the silence had grown thick enough to breathe. The candles in the parlor were cold and crooked, their wicks buried in hardened wax. The white dresses hung limp where they had been thrown over chairs, the fabric streaked with soot. Upstairs, Ella Lanena Whitfield sat before her mirror, her reflection blurred by the misted glass. Her hair had come undone. She had not changed her gown, now streaked brown at the hem. The black journal lay closed on the desk, a single ribbon marking the last page. "They're gone," she whispered to her reflection. "Gone." The words seemed to please and terrify her all at once. She laughed, a soft, broken sound, and then began to weep without moving her face. Her daughters stayed upstairs, listening to the uneven rhythm of that laugh and that crying until it blended into one sound. Marianne's bed was empty, the sheets still damp where she had last lain. None of the sisters dared touch it. By the second day, the servants who remained began to drift away, one to a cousin's farm, another toward the town road. No one asked permission. They carried nothing but what they could hide in their pockets and the memory of the night's thunder. Ruth was the last to go. She paused on the porch, looking back once. Through the tall window she could see Elena at the dining table, staring at nothing, the Bible open in front of her. Ruth whispered, "Lord, forgive her," and stepped into the wet morning. On the third day, a rider from town arrived with the preacher. They had heard the rumors, the storm, the screams, the woman seen walking the balcony with no lantern. The preacher's name was Caldwell, a thin man with a trembling voice but a spine of iron. He found her sitting at the table still, hands folded neatly as though expecting guests. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said gently, "you should rest. You look saved," she interrupted, and her lips curved in something that wasn't a smile. He hesitated, glancing at the open Bible. The page was marked in red ink, the verse underlined twice. "Is greater than asterisk. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." Asterisk. "What is it you think you've sown, Mum?" he asked. Her eyes lifted to him, dull and fevered. "Perfection." He swallowed hard. "And what did it reap?" She leaned forward, whispering as if confiding a secret. "Freedom." When he left the house an hour later, his hands shook. "She's beyond my reach," he told the men waiting outside. "Beyond the Lord's too, unless he chooses to fetch her himself." That night, thunder rolled again in the distance, not the rage of a storm this time, but a low, steady rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. The daughters huddled in their room, holding hands in the dark. "Do you hear that?" Clara asked. "It's just the wind," Louise said, though she didn't believe it. Marianne's youngest sister, barely 12, whispered, "She keeps talking to someone." "She's always talking," Louise answered. "No," the girl said, "someone's talking back." A floorboard creaked outside their door, then another. Footsteps slow, dragging, too heavy to be a servant's. They waited for a knock that never came. When morning arrived, they found no prints in the dust. By the fifth day, Elena no longer came downstairs. The house settled into a kind of death watch. The daughters brought food to her door and left it untouched. From time to time they heard her pacing, or reciting from her journal, or humming a melody none of them recognized. Then, one dawn, the sounds stopped. They broke the door at mid-morning. The room was empty. The window stood open, the curtains billowing in the soft wind. On the desk lay the Bible, still open to the same page. A single line had been added in her handwriting, faint and unsteady. "Is greater than asterisk. The river takes what is offered." Asterisk. Down by the water, they found the hem of her gown caught on a branch, and nothing else. The river moved on, indifferent. For days afterward, people from neighboring farms came to look at the house, some out of curiosity, others out of duty. They said the air inside was colder than it should have been, that whispers moved through the hall even when no one spoke. The preacher returned once more to deliver a blessing. He stood in the ruined parlor, the smell of rain still clinging to the walls, and prayed aloud, "Lord, grant peace to those who sought power, and mercy to those who suffered under it." But as he closed the Bible, a gust of wind tore through the house, scattering the ashes of burned pages from the fireplace. They spiraled upward, twisting through the air like black snow. He left without looking back. By the next spring, the plantation lay quiet. The fields had gone to weeds. The cotton gins stood rusting in their sheds. Travelers on the main road began to cross themselves when passing the gates. They said you could still hear crying from the riverbank when the wind came from the east. Others claimed that, on nights heavy with thunder, a pale woman could be seen walking the veranda, her gown whipping in the storm, calling a name no one could understand. In the small church at Millhaven, a new entry appeared in the parish book beside the Whitfield family name, "Is greater than asterisk. All gone to God, or to the water, asterisk." And that was all anyone ever wrote. The house remained, tall and white against the grey horizon, a monument to the cost of pride. No laughter, no voices, only the sound of shutters rattling in the wind like breath in a dying throat. Far downriver, weeks later, a fisherman claimed he saw two figures on the opposite bank at dusk, a man and a young woman, hand in hand, watching the current. When he waved, they did not answer. A blink later, they were gone, as if the river itself had closed over their memory. He told the story in town that night, and no one doubted him, because everyone in Millhaven knew the river kept what the house could not. Years passed. The world outside the Whitfield plantation changed, the railways came, towns grew, and war swept through the south like a cleansing fire, but nothing truly touched that stretch of land. The great house still stood, half-eaten by vines and humidity, its white columns blackened with mildew, its shutters hanging like broken eyelids. The people of Millhaven called it the widow's tomb. Children dared each other to run up the front steps and touch the door before sundown. Few ever made it past the first stair. They said you could hear a woman's voice calling from the upper window when the thunder rolled in soft, lilting, persuasive. Sometimes it called a name, Josiah, other times it simply wept. Farmhands refused to work the nearby fields. Travelers who lost their way along the old road claimed to see lanterns swinging between the trees, moving without hands. And every spring, when the rains came heavy, the river rose high enough to touch the edge of the property. Those who lived close to the water swore they saw shapes standing at the bank when the lightning flashed two silhouettes, side by side, staring back toward the house.